Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. We have quite a bit of ground to cover. There's been a lot that's happened in just less than a week from our last recording date. We had last recorded on Saturday, that episode aired on Sunday. We are here on Friday night giving you another episode of the War Report. And if you're watching this at the premiere, it will be Saturday morning, so without further ado, we can get right into it. We got plenty of news about Ukraine, of course, a lot of the news about Europe, a little bit about the Middle East, and then getting some stuff about Asia and Kazakhstan, and then a little bit of some domestic U.S. news to round out the show. But we'll get right into it with our updates on Ukraine, which is where I give the floor to you.
Okay. So I will say, as customary, I will begin with the Southern Front. Um, Generally speaking, the Southern Front is tense, but there is a stalemate. There's nothing really going on. However, with one exception, and in a way, this will highlight some of the other stories around Ukraine, and that is the Ukrainians have resumed shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Every time they've done this, uh, it becomes like a sign of desperation. They need a blackmail. They need some extraordinary event that will change the course. It very much is for them like living out their faith about what Ukraine means for them. Um, Not only like huge losses, but even greater sacrifice. If if there's another Chernobyl, so be it. As long as there's a Ukraine, and whatever, whoever gets hurt in that doesn't matter. Um, so I would say, now they didn't hit any of the infrastructure, but it appears that they were targeting the Russian forces that are stationed there to monitor and protect the power plant. Um, there's been ongoing talks and even to an extent negotiations with the IAEA, who still pretend that it could be Russia that's shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, not Ukraine. Or it could be Ukraine. We'll just never know. So, anyways, that's about it really for the Southern Front. But there's been very small stuff. It's not worth, it's not really worth getting into. The situation in Ugledar is still very much a stalemate. The Russians managed to recapture some of the dachias east of Ugledar. The Russians have also made more gains north of Diivka, which has been one of those linchpins used to bomb Donetsk City for now going close to 9 years in April. So, but of course, the really big news is Bakhmut. And enormous news. This morning, I woke up and I saw the video with Prigozhin, who basically made an appeal to Zelensky, telling him, like, show some humanity. I'm really paraphrasing here. Um, you, you know, we're encountering a lot of old men and children in the ranks, and they want to go home and rejoin their motherland. Don't send them to their deaths, right? Now, and of course, the camera pans over, and you see two young men and an old man. Essentially, I mean, the war might have aged him, but to my eyes, he seems definitely over 65. Could be as old as 70, but I can't confirm one way or the other. But the interesting thing about Bakhmut is that in the way that it was taken, um, you could see that with the fall of Solidar, that it was basically eventually would be over because Solidar was extremely well protected. Bakhmut was very well protected. Both these places received a lot of defenses installed, and but the outlining towns like Krasnogora, for instance, less so because they didn't feel that it was necessary to install so many defenses. In any case, after the fall of Solidar, I think the Russian expansion, especially westward, even surprised me. Now, in the south, uh, that isn't the case. The south has been difficult for the Russians. They regained some land that they had lost outside of Ivanovske, or some people, or I think the Russians call it Krasnoye. Um, so but there is one area where they did advance, and that was in the southern part of Bakhmut itself. And they got within 200 meters of one of the official roads that leads into the city. In the north, uh, the Russians have made significant gains, both south, moving south from the north, in the city proper and in the outlining areas. And that has brought them in within, I think, 500 to 800 meters, I think 800 meters from one of the official supply lines. So that means all these roads now, the Russians don't have to rely on artillery. They can use RPGs, for instance, or the anti-tank missile systems. So what that is doing is it's forcing the Ukrainians to essentially go through smaller streets, go across farm fields and small country roads. There's one left, a very narrow one, where they can get in and out. But um, like I said, um, there's multiple sources that are saying that the east side of Bakhmut, which is one third the size of the entire city, has been evacuated by the Ukrainians. And if you look at the tactics of the Ukrainians, they had like their good fighters stationed in the south, around Chasov Yar, and in the north. Many of them died in Solidar. Those were the guys that were defending Solidar that refused to give up. Um, those are the guys with the yellow bands. Those are their professional trained soldiers. The guys with the green bands are their territorial forces. So they're not as well trained, and they can be left inside the city essentially because, well, they're better defended, and it takes, let's say, less tactical knowledge to defend from a building than in an open field or hiding in a forest. Um, Moving up north, in Seversk, it's basically a stalemate. There's nothing going on there. However, moving to the extreme north, around Kupiansk, the Russians have made significant gains there now. Yesterday they announced they were 3 kilometers from the edge of Kupiansk. A few days before, they said that they were 12 kilometers or 15 kilometers south. And I think I'm seeing 3 kilometers over and over again. My guess is they're very close, that they've made gains. And Ukrainian channels have said that they have actually begun evacuating people. Now, these are people that are, close to them, let's say, that are civilian but on their side. That's what I'm guessing. So that's really it for for the frontline news.
Well, there's certainly some fascinating developments out of that, and I was actually going through the take mill, as it were, Twitter, Telegram, etc., etc., and I did see one that particularly stuck out to me that I did want to mention on the show that in regards
Hmm.
to Bakhmut with the success of the Wagner group, this is the first time in modern history, and even with the modern conception of a private military company with private military contractors, we have seen a an army, a military, built the traditional way for the 19th, 20th, 21st century with conscripted men, all of the standard things you'd expect, be bested by a contractor group. And somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I did think that was an interesting development with that. And for those of you who have been following this war, Wagner has been punching far above their weight, despite some of the reports of them having been reduced by 80% as a result of this war and
Yeah.
taking however many casualties. But I do think it
You
is
can't hold on to that much territory and lose that many men.
it,
It's just
it,
not possible.
exactly, exactly. But I do think, especially analyzing the generations of warfare, which is something I've always tried to do on the show, and saying how in the past few episodes Ukraine has made me reconsider some things I've believed in the past few years. But one thing where I think fourth generation warfare is strong is the idea of these strong, organized, and skilled private military organizations, private military companies, whatever you want to call them, being able to really have such an outsized influence in a war effort like this. And it is interesting because you go back through the history of Wagner, they've been all over the world. They really cut their teeth in Syria is probably what they're most well known for, but they've been all over Africa, pretty much anywhere where there's any instability, any sort of active combat, they've been there. So they've gained their experience that way. But of course, time also isn't on their side in the experience. But whenever the Ukrainians tried to form some sort of response to that, whether that be groups like the Mozart's group or the Boris Johnson
Yeah.
Battalion or
Yeah,
whatever
that's right.
ridiculous name they give all of these, they can never really succeed in the same way, even with all the support, even with, and as you were telling me before the show, with the evacuation, there were reports of a large amount of English speaking foreign mercenaries in the
Yeah.
battle. So even with all of that, even with what we can only presume is many soldiers coming from abroad, especially from Western countries that have a bit more power behind them militarily, places like the U.S. where you probably could build a sizable military company. I mean, it's the one that Eric Prince runs. I can't remember how they had Blackwater. Had they rebranded? I can't
Right,
remember.
right.
But point being is, I mean I have no illusions that they're not knee deep into this whole thing, but at least from the reports I've heard, and this could just be complete selection bias, this could just be I overlooked it, they haven't had that same outsized punch when it comes to this influence of this war either. Now, it's a bit harder with an explicitly foreign group coming in to do that, but you would imagine that if Western military standards are really what we say they are, we would have seen something akin to that being able to at least plug the dam.
Yeah. You know, um, I mean, there's Western sources now, and just this week alone, that are actually publishing. Like, there's a major shift in the narrative that's happening right now, and some of it is quite mainstream. You're seeing publications in the West now mentioning that Ukrainian losses are over 250,000. Now, they lump civilians with that, but civilians would be a fraction in comparison. Oh, I mean, I would say well over 10,000 dead civilians is not unlikely, but that still leaves the lion's share for Ukraine to be military. And, some sources have even said that it's more like 200,000 soldiers are left.
And given the size of Ukraine's conscription pool over the past, I believe we're up to 9 conscription drives, it's not a surprise that the majority of the
Yeah.
casualties have been military when they are mobilizing so many men.
Right. Now, the West is promising 50,000 troops will be ready by the end of March to enter. But this also brings up another shift in the narrative. And you're having Pentagon officials this week who have said, and they have not asked for anonymity, who have said that, if Ukraine does not produce results in the next 6 to 7 months, then they cannot promise any more that arms shipments and support for Ukraine will not decrease. They definitely, like, a lot of this is optics stuff. You have this recent um, terrorist attack that took place, I believe it was yesterday or this morning in
Yes.
Bryansk. This is an area of Western Russia that's wedged between Ukraine and Belarus. And you have, uh, I mean, they claim to be Russians who were fighting on the side of Ukraine. And it turns out like two or three of them are actually Russian. One of them moved with his mother. I think he goes by the name of, his handle is Keating or something. Um, so I'm assuming that his yes, Nikitin. Now he was interviewed, I believe, by the Financial Times, right? So like, if the Financial Times is normalizing these guys, you can tell they're ready to ramp up the West. They're ready to psychologically escalate the West for a total dehumanization of Russians. And there was an article in I believe the Telegraph that talked about uh, physical violence and targeting of Russians living in Britain and in other parts of Europe. But Nikitin is interesting. Let me find his real name. That isn't his real name. Um, Sorry, it will take just a second.
But since you had brought up Bryansk, and yes, as you had said,
Mhm.
it's right there where the three borders of the countries Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia do meet. It does, and this is the first instant of its kind, but it's not the first instant to cross into Russia proper. And it does make you ask some fundamental questions. While I have certainly not adopted the opinion that Russia's completely botching this war, they're heading towards defeat, as many people have even since day one, it does make you question some of the conduct of the Russian leadership in this war when, at this point, not only are you still having Donetsk City get shelled, you're still having all across the Donbass, all these areas that have been legally accepted into the Russian Federation being under constant risk of attack, with, once again, millions of Russian citizens in there, but even pre war territory still being under some level of threat. Now, I'm no strategist, I'm no tactician, I'm no grand planner, don't get me wrong, so I can only speak so much to this, but this seems like a very gaping hole in just the defense of Russia's people as it is, the fact that something like this was even able to get off the ground into the first place. Now, you could go down the 64D underwater chess thing and say, well, it's very Machiavellian and they're allowing it to create a rise in the Russian people so there'll be more support for the war effort. Well, I don't think support for a war effort is really an issue at this point, looking at the state of the Russian population, if some of the polls that we are receiving are to be believed, which I think they are mostly to be believed. Some room for skepticism, but I think we can more or less take them at face value. I'll just leave it at that. So it does make me wonder what really is going on there when you have these attacks that can land inside Russia. Now, I know, of course, why the Ukrainians are doing them. I have no doubt that they're being egged on by the Empire and the West, or whatever we're going to refer to it as, being egged on from the outside as well. I mean, not that there's no desire for Ukrainians to do this themselves, but it does really raise a lot of questions as to why something like this was even in the question.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of this has to deal with trying to force, like, there's several things at play here, right? So Ukraine is not doing very well right now. They haven't been able to take new territories since the, first or second week of November last year. The other is to try to stretch the Russian military. Um, so that's to extend its resources. Now, the guy that I was talking about, Nikitin. His actual name is Kapustin, Dennis Kapustin, and he lived in Germany. His mother emigrated to Germany in the 90s or in 2001, somewhere around there, as part of a Jewish resettling thing. Um, I know, right? I know. So like, yeah, there you go. So. Um, Now, he made several contacts because a lot of the extreme nationalist right in Russia just end up living in Ukraine, and he did too. There is another guy that was part of this attack, and Kirill Kanakin. Uh, Same kind of thing. Has a swastika on his head. He was a yoga instructor at St. Petersburg. Like the stuff is
You really
hilarious. It's
the
it's just incredible.
this is
So
from the Russian boomer Nosbal's like darkest description of the future. These kind of people, like
yeah,
these Western, let's just say, of a certain orientation when it comes to attraction to the same sex, who are into this weird New Age Eastern stuff, and to top it all off, National Socialism. It's really their fever dream, and frankly,
yeah,
they're completely justified in it at this point, at least.
yeah. Like I mean, I was shocked when this Dennis fella turned out. I mean, unless his mother like lied,
Not unheard of.
completely.
That's how you
Not
have.
unheard of,
Uh,
but there's also a good chance that his mom is Jewish, and
wouldn't that
so
just be the cherry
here
on
you have
top?
this strange confluence of like Judaism and neo-Nazism, and because they have a common enemy. There was a recent article, again, the head rabbi of Moscow who left wrote an article about you can let me I'm just trying to see which
I keep
paper
hammering
this
this
was
point home,
in.
but I think it is worth repeating. I imagine if you're watching the show, you have some idea what I'm talking about, but for those of you who don't, you have no idea how liberating it is to be able to have a logically consistent worldview where you can believe that a Jewish neo-Nazi exists. Because I can
Yeah,
completely believe that. And I think people who can't, once again, it's not logical on the surface, I'll fully admit that. But once you can come to the conclusion, come to a logical solution as to where those two things can coexist together, it's it opens up a whole new world of analysis for you. Let me just tell you that much.
right. Because what did we witness during Trump's presidency and even the year after, and it's still around now, right? Is this cultural battle between conservatives and liberals? Um, Definitely like more the radical right. And no, we don't bemoan them. Obviously, we're on the right as well. But just to round out this point, right? They're not friends here. But you notice that when they were trying to topple Lukashenko in Belarus, you had a partnership between like literally gays and empowered women
And the guys in the
and
stall
and the
helms.
ultra right wingers, right? Who that failed, and they set up their own battalion to go fight on the side of Ukraine, right? So because they both hate Russia, that's what unites them, right? Like, why does we've talked about Poland and Hungary, but I mean, after this war, it's just Poland. Why do they tolerate all the NGOs and um, the global homo NGOs? Why do they tolerate that, right? Because um, Well, they think that that's going being in NATO and being in the EU will empower them, and some of the hardcore right in Poland, and Poland has lost 2,500 men in Ukraine so far. That's quite a bit for like an irregular army, an army that's officially not at war. Those are volunteers, and and of course you have crazy stories where the Ukrainians killed them or the Poles killed the Ukrainians, both for arguing about whether to go in a battle or not, whether it's winnable or not. Anyways, so you these partnerships of extremes that would never get along, like historically, there is a precedent for that, right? So um, you know, it might seem far fetched in a place like America or Canada because these groups are vehemently opposed to one another, right? But that's not the case because the situation in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia are entirely different, and that's why they work together. Of course, uh, I forget the name of the guy who, he was a member of the Duma. Remember, he bragged. He's in the Russia Freedom Party, and he sits on these councils about how Russia will be divided, and of course, he expects to have like a nice position once that takes place. And he's living in exile. He's a Guaido, right? But he's a liberal, right? But um, Russians who have joined the Ukrainians to, and make no mistake, like they intentionally highlighted these three Russian guys who, most of them were already living in Ukraine. Um, One of them that I mentioned, he actually he's been fighting in Ukraine since 2015. So, um, uh, yeah, Alexei Olegovich Kozhemyakin. So yeah, he's been in one of these extreme right wing groups since 2015. He's not unusual, but if you look at the reports of somewhere between 40 to 80 men invaded the Bryansk region, and of course they killed two pensioners who were driving children to school. They wounded a 10-year-old girl, but there was also a 10-year-old boy that was also wounded in the ribs, and he got the other two kids, two girls. He got them out of the car. I'm presuming those girls weren't wounded, and he told them to hide in the woods. When he felt it was safe, he went on the road and waved the car, and there's video footage of him in the hospital in Bryansk region. He's already been given like the Hero of Russia award. He's just a kid, right? Um, like this whole thing, this whole terrorist attack will play very badly because, of course, one of these guys, and I think uh, it was not the guy that I'm talking about right now, Alexei Olegovich. It was the other guy, Kapustin, who knocked on the plaque of this little official governmental building in this village of less than 150 people. Um, that Russia, wake up, don't be slaves, right? Like it's a desperate act, right? And they're not going to win anybody over. Like value-free judgment, if they wanted to be more successful, they should have done this like before the war and not kill civilians and not maim children. Like that would have been the right thing to do. But it's failed, and you can see that this is a desperate attack. And then they, of course, um, Kupustin, Nikitin, that's his call sign. He did say, of course, we had clearance from Ukraine because the Ukrainians at first were like celebrating this. Well, at first they said, no, this is a Russian gay op. Then they were celebrating it because he said it's real. And then, as the story developed, that like there were kids that were maimed, and one of the girls had to go to the hospital, just like the boy did, and two pensioners were killed. They started to back off, but he was in I think the Financial Times. Like he had a previous interview. I'm not saying that He just did an interview with the Financial Times, but he has been on it. Another one of these guys, also Russian, um, he was on CNN. So, they intentionally took the Russian guys to try to get the Russian public to go along with it, right? Because, the the Ukrainians basically cold call people and ask them if they want to give coordinates. There was a 22-year-old guy who was arrested in Zaporozhye, and basically it was, we'll give you 40 US dollars if you tell us where the Russians are. And he did that. And he started asking for his money. And then his payout was that the Ukrainians actually told the Russians that he was and then he got arrested. So, like, it's an insane situation. Anyhow, like nothing, it's like the Zaporozhye power plant. Like no one will be impressed. Um, the Russians aren't going to be swayed by this. Um, you can look at it as a test run. Like, what if they started to attack Transnistria? It would probably look something like this, right? You can look at this as a kind of a probing action because while there is military, this is and the land is like this long, skinny worm of a land. It's very narrow. It's very hard for. I'm told there's like 10,000 soldiers there. It would be very hard to defend this area. I mean, they could just drive right through and create several little cauldrons all at the same time. What Russia would do in retaliation is not known. However, Danilov, one of the military secretaries of Zelensky, uh, has expressed to Sandu that if Sandu wishes for a Ukrainian military intervention into Transnistria, he will do it, and that can be joint or otherwise. So,
And this has also been a question since the beginning of this war, particularly in the last few months. I believe it was it would have been around September, around the time of the Ukrainian counteroffensives, where there was rumors of a joint Romanian-Moldovan operation into Transnistria. Now,
yeah,
that never came to fruition, and of course, that was when the war was in Ukraine's favor, at least in terms of initiative. But now that the situation has changed so drastically, one could even say a 180-degree turn in this war, what we have now is the real possibility of breaking into one of the largest post Soviet arms depots in the world. And I'll get into
yeah,
some of the stories about Serbia and the alleged arms shipments and the uh, what seems to be smuggling operation, but I'll save that
they
for the
are. Yeah.
next couple minutes here.
Hmm.
So we have this territory that has once again about 10,000 what could realistically in any other context would be called militiamen from Pridnestrovia or Transnistria, whichever you prefer. On top of that, about 1,200 Russian quote unquote peacekeepers who probably aren't the battle hardened guys who are going
Yeah.
to fend off what is possibly a two front war on a very indefensible piece of land. And with all of that, it does make you think that now that the war is turned so much against Ukraine, I'm not saying it's completely over for them, but it's turned far worse for them than it probably at any point, at least since the beginning of the war. This would, if they could secure their arms stockpiles, it would breathe a whole new life into Ukraine, both morale wise and just by pure logistics. It wouldn't win them the war or anything, but it would give them the resources to dig in if they could extract most supplies. Now, if the supplies were scuttled, which, as we were discussing previously, the Russians and the local forces probably do have a plan to go scorched earth on those supplies if they're ever at risk of falling into hostile hands. Going in and imposing control over another ethnic Russian enclave is once again another morale boost, another PR victory for them. So I'm not going to say this operation is 100% certain, but it's far more likely than it was in September for those reasons. And I would say that the longer this goes on and the more desperate it gets, the more likely Transnistria will be attacked for those reasons. And at that point, there's nothing Russia can do to actually save Transnistria, but only can really, I guess you could say, avenge them at that point. So it's a
Right.
very dire situation there, and I wouldn't be surprised if what we know as Transnistria, the unrecognized state we know as Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, does not exist by the end of the year. I'm not going to put that in ink, but I'm going to pencil it in, so to speak. And it's really a matter of when rather than if, in my opinion, that at some point, whether it's during this war, whether it's after this war, some sort of reprisal, they will find a way to take this out. Now, there is a large amount of unrest in Moldova, which we will get into in a little bit, in which case I'll save that to describe what I think is probably the best case scenario for Transnistria and its people, but I'll hold off on that while we just finish up some of the Ukraine news and then move into some of the European news. So, there was talk within the Ukrainian legislature, and one of the MPs, her name escapes me, but was saying this real no real path for victory for Ukraine at
Yeah.
this point. And this does seem to be a sentiment growing among the Ukrainian elite, if not in words, then in actions, because there has been an interesting string of events when it comes to some of the most powerful people in Ukraine, some of the most influential people in Ukraine, and their family members. So, for starters, as far as we know right now, Arestovich is enjoying a nice vacation in Rome. Personally, I don't blame him. It's a very nice vacation destination. Speaking from personal experience, putting that aside, he has been more or less confirmed to be. There's not one. I mean, they've denied it. It's not 100% solid proof, but anyone with the ability to deduce can realize, yeah, that's Arestovich. And then there was an interesting video put out by a woman from Kharkov detailing just a few of the locations of the Ukrainian elites and their family members. So I'm just going to go over a
Yes.
few of those because it was pretty interesting. And you have Arestovich in Rome, as we mentioned, the former deputy to the office of the president, Kirill Timoshenko, is in Israel. He has made Aliyah, as it were. The ex-deputy of the Servant of the People Party, Nikolai Tischenko, is now in Thailand. Arseny Yastenuk is in Miami. You have Yulia Timoshenko and her husband are in Dubai. And the son of Poroshenko, Mikhail Poroshenko, is in London. And then you also have the mayor of Odessa's son, Trunikov, is also in London as well. And there was something actually very funny in that video where they pointed out that Poroshenko's son, Mikhail Poroshenko, was referring to himself as a Russian in London. And just a little bit of background information for those of you who may not remember the earliest days of the Maidan. Poroshenko had to learn Ukrainian while in office from his wife. Had spoken Russian the entirety of his life before. And then you have his son calling himself a Russian, despite what is a very ostensibly Ukrainian surname, Poroshenko, although the surnames are a bit fluid in that part of the world. I will give them that much. But although that's only a small cross section of the elite, and there's probably a lot more of the children, the male family members, the MPs who are abroad, or anyone with any amount of influence. For example, I doubt Kolomoisky's kin are fighting in this war, both in the immediate and the ethnic sense there. But with what you have there, now of course, this isn't unheard of. The children of elites, they do have privileges. Whether they're enumerated or whether it's just understood. It's just something that happens. I'm not saying that as a good or a bad thing, it's just something that happens. And while you may think in the American context, of course, there were many people who got out of. Well, I'll put it in completely in the American context. So, when you had the Second World War, at least from the research I've done about the way the draft was conducted, the way conscription was conducted, really nobody was able to get out of it because it was viewed as such an existential war. Didn't matter who you were. You had politicians resigning to actually resume their military careers to fight in this war. Then let's go 20 years later to Vietnam, once again within the American context. You had the height of what I guess could probably be called the draft dodger movement. You had these systems put in place where a the children of the elite could get deferments because of their education. Actually, that's part of the reason why law school still takes so long. It actually is a legacy left over from the Vietnam War. But point being is that that war was viewed as a foreign adventure. Despite what the propaganda may have said, everyone understood it was really a very low stakes war for America. We didn't really have that much investment to win. If we lost, there wouldn't be too many casualties except maybe a little bit of egg on our face, which is exactly what happened. But when you look at a war that is objectively existential insofar as the position of Ukrainian identity is concerned, that if you view Ukraine as this whole united nation and Russia as this usurper that is trying to reconquer these lands that's occupied for centuries, once again going into the whole Ukrainian national mythology, you would think that at this point nobody would really be spared from this what can only be called national struggle, this struggle for survival. Now, of course, there'll be examples here and there, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this, but when you have this high of level of both elites and their family members going abroad, it does not spell confidence for number one, the actual material reality of this war, and number two, the narrative that's trying to be spun about the utmost importance of this war, even from the Ukrainian perspective.
Right. And this basically lines up with the criticism of Ukraine being so corrupt that roughly a third to a half of the over $100 billion has been given to it, has been smuggled or laundered one way or another. So it's a horrible look, to say the least. It doesn't warrant, as you say, the kind of messaging for the Ukrainian identity to have so many of these elites make sure that their children are not involved. Because there are, frankly, I consider a boy who's 16, 17, 18, 19, they're all, to me, they're kids, they're children. Children in wars are nothing new. I understand that, but this is probably like a situation that I think a lot of the planners for this war in Ukraine and the U.S. did not anticipate would happen, and yet they are. And you also have these optic stunts like the drone that flew and landed on the Russian AWACS plane in Belarus, and then claiming that it was destroyed, but there's no video footage of it, and everyone went bonkers. And then there was an American um, satellite provider who published the photos and showed that there wasn't any attack, there was no damage. And that's the funny thing about Ukraine, right? Is they have a lot of false stories, but there's also true stories. There are attacks that are very successful by them. And this sort of brings me, now that we're talking about the Ukrainian identity, about what motivates them, right? So, these attacks, I think a good portion of the population thinks they're absolutely real. And they did happen. And part of it is, well, some of them did actually happen. But I would say half or more never happened, or they're not the success that they think they were. There is a kind of fundamental belief in each segment of the society. So if we're talking about, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine and the far right in Ukraine, right? or you're talking about the liberals in Ukraine and everything else in between, they fundamentally believe that America and the West will not give up on them under any circumstances. They truly believe that. As fervently as they believe that they're part of this other civilization called Europe. Um, they also, of course, spent 8, 9 years ignoring what their own forces were doing to Donbass. So, and many of them, in many ways, they've glommed on to the idea of themselves as a victim. And that, in a way, absolves them from any kind of, let's say, guilt for the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. Of course, this process has legitimized the whole coup, the American coup in Kiev in 2014 as well. Um, so I think these are like the optic stuff is important not just for Western supporters but for Ukraine itself. Um, it does raise the morale. Like you brought up Transnistria, and it would it would raise their morale, for instance, if they made an attack on Transnistria, because they would have some kind of even limited success, no question. And if they would do it, and they rely on that, right? And they, I think they are actually willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. I'm not saying all of them, but I am saying like
Enough of them.
enough are willing. And if you believe some of the polls coming out of Ukraine, 89% want the war to continue until every inch is taken back. That includes Crimea. Again, I would I would hazard to say that take that with a pinch of salt. We don't know what the real stats are. Remember, that too is an optics game. All media in Ukraine has been censored. Various media companies have been criminalized. 10 political parties have been criminalized. Those weren't even like pro-Russian parties. Those parties just, maybe they didn't want this war, or maybe they did, but they were critical of the way it was being handled. Well, they're gone, right? So uh, this is this is not like a democracy as the Americans claim it is. And I think even some things, like for instance, um, the retired General Keith Kellogg, he was the advisor to Mike Pence. Recently, he was quoted as saying, using here to use Ukraine to fight Russia because that takes a strategic adversary off the table without using any of its troops. Uh, we can focus on our primary adversary, which is China. I think the belief in like the Ukrainian identity mythos is that yes, China has to be destroyed, of course, right? Because they're just like the Mongols. I understand that, right? But I don't think they can, like, they can't bring themselves to believe that they could freeze this conflict. The Americans could, once the Americans are sure that Russia will not be able to aid China in a future war with China and the U.S. Uh, I still think they believe that they have this preference, because I mean, one logic that we've talked about many times on this show is that if you balkanize Russia, then fighting China is super easy, which wouldn't be the case if that didn't happen. So, they have the reasons for being committed to that, but I don't think that's the only option that America has decided to keep on the table either, right? Um, things aren't going as well as they could be, and 2024 next year is an election year, and Biden will have to, he's determined to run, and Biden will have to show success, and they will expect success. Now, if you take the word of some of the Pentagon generals that in the last 2 weeks have been saying, if Ukraine doesn't mount a serious and effective counteroffensive, particularly in the south, right? Because it looks like Donbass is done, especially once Bakhmut falls. Bakhmut, according to Prigozhin, and to all things aside, he loves to troll, but he's never lied about when he expects the city to fall, and he always said that Bakhmut would fall before April. And in the recent video I highlighted earlier in the show, he said, you know, roughly in the next 48 hours, it's going to fall. And that will be a very, very big moment for the way this war is going. Um, what happens to escalation there and then? I don't know. Uh, there will be panic in the American side. They will be asking for escalation. Um, Russia so far has not completely committed to an economy that's on a war footing, primarily because their economy is doing so well and they don't want to scare the public. They don't want a full mobilization, which would damage the economy. And so that's why, really, right now, it's just about Russian firepower and Russian industrial strength that is winning this war for them.
And I will
But
remind
the
you,
escalation would bring about the very thing that the Russians are avoiding.
yes, I completely agree with that. And I will remind you and the audience and just everyone in general, on that same note, about the wanting results, about the question of toppling Russia in order to make confronting China an easier task, and just all of what we have been discussing for about the past 5 to 10 minutes here. I will reference once again that document that came out of one of Soros's NGOs about mobilizing the Eastern Europeans to defeat Russia. They've done that with Ukraine so
Mhm.
far. And with the way it's looking, it looks like they're probably to some degree going to be able to do that with Poland. So if this war
Right, and there's
does
news about
continue,
Poland.
yes, if this war does continue in the direction that it has been going, the push for Poland to intervene in this war as an independent actor, and by independent I mean outside of direct NATO confrontation, where NATO can send them in without the liability of having to invoke Article 5 if Polish troops are attacked, it opens up a whole new dimension of this war because you have Poland, which is a nation that has been arming itself for the past year, a nation that has been confirmed to have been supplying large amounts of ammunition to Ukraine before February 24th, 2022, before the invasion of the country as it was. We had mentioned before that it's estimated 2,500 casualties have been taken by Polish volunteers, and there are claims out of Donbass media outlets that are unconfirmed that a Polish Leopard 2 tank crew was captured in battle. Now, there's been no photos, there's been no videos, so we have nothing to really go on with that.
I
But
big if true.
yes, as the saying goes, big if true. And all of this coming together, it's really the last ditch effort they can do, convincing Poland or maybe even, say, for example, Romania, who I do think would be a bit more hesitant to go along with something like this, but I wouldn't count out of the cards. Hungary, completely off the table, which is why they're working so hard to undermine Hungary. But Poland and any other nations, and not just volunteers, but nations as sovereign actors, insofar as they actually have sovereignty, which is very limited given their arrangement with NATO, the European Union, etc. That's the last ditch they have in this war before having to escalate this thing into a world war, which is what they desperately won't want because they, even in their demented states, and I'm referring to one in particular, I'm sure you can imagine, still realize the apocalyptic potential of what the nukes going off means. They still have a fundamental understanding of that. And even the Russians also have a fundamental understanding. There's a mutually assured destruction is still in play for the time being. Now, will that degrade as time goes on? Will that degrade as, for example, with the news out of Bryansk, with the media outlets interviewing those people and people connected to that, as the dehumanization continues, will that become a more and more palatable option? I think that question is a few years down the road before we can really give a reasonable answer to that. But if, or I should say when Russia inevitably takes the definitive upper hand in this war once again, because there still is a bit of Ukrainian resistance. This isn't quite what it was in the first few weeks of the war when Russia was just sweeping across the country. But when that comes to that, it's either going to be we're either going to believe what the Pentagon says, and there's going to be some sort of negotiation attempt, some sort of earnest negotiation attempt in order to actually freeze this conflict. Not even end it, just freeze this conflict to take the burden off. Or we're going to get an escalation from other nations that are also willing to throw themselves into the meat grinder, which I do believe that there is a very, very real chance of Poland getting involved. I know I've said that
Yeah.
for months now, but they've already sacrificed 2,500 men to this, and that's to keep in mind. I think that's now not the combined totals, but I think Iraq individually and Afghanistan individually, the Americans had less casualties. Just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, not including mercenaries, contractors, because
Yes,
it would be more than double that. But um,
the
and that
official
is a way
numbers.
to keep numbers low. And I mean, you have countries like Israel, for instance, and it's I believe the war in 1967. Most people, I mean, there's research on it that their casualties were much higher than they bragged they were. There's photos from the desert. There's one in particular where it shows dozens upon dozens of them. In any case, there's some, in a war, the more you lose, in a way, it's like gambling. The more you lose, the more you feel like you have to play it to the end. And what's waiting for you on the other side is really the demoralization of generations to come, and anger. Um, in many ways, you see this with Georgia. Um, but Ukraine does not believe it's like Georgia. Ukraine believes it's more valuable than Georgia, and in many ways it is. But so yeah, I could see Poland. Now there was an infograph of which countries have contributed the most amount of money. I mean, take America off the table, obviously it dwarfs everybody else. Uh, but if you look at per capita, like of what a country's GDP is and what they're giving, I mean, Estonia is right at the top. And then you have Latvia, then Lithuania. Romania is less than 1/3 of 1%, but Poland's is pretty substantial. But it's only about like 8 or 9% of its total military spending. Of course, a lot of the military spending it's doing right now that is quote unquote for itself could very well be involved in Ukraine, in the next 6 months. We don't know.
And I do want to bring
Um,
up a point on that note regarding the idea of another country getting in. And Orban has been transgressing once again lately. And one of his particular statements this week was, quote, Hungary fears that one of the EU countries will send its troops into Ukraine. He expressed serious concern that the whole of Europe is slipping into the war. And on top
yeah,
of that, he once again reiterated that Europeans have to learn to live in peace with Russia. Now, what exactly the terms of this peace are, I mean, everyone would, most everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, most everyone would agree to that statement. But of course, a lot of that statement is qualified with a lot of people would agree with it. Russia must be completely castrated. Now, I don't believe that Orban is saying that, but most people who would agree to that statement, even in Europe, would say yes. So long as Russia is cut down to size, so long as they give up X, Y, and Z, and Crimea, and all the absurd demands they always put out there. But
yeah,
this could just be rhetoric that he has been employing since the beginning of the war, both for domestic support and for support within, I guess you could say, the dissident nations of Europe. But you also do have to realize that him being the prime minister of a European Union country, he is certainly privy to information that the rest of us are not. And for all we know, this could be a genuine warning that maybe he and now I know relations between Poland and Hungary have certainly strained since the outbreak of this war for obvious reasons. But just as part of the collective European Union, part of the collective of NATO, there's still a lot of information, there's still a lot of intelligence sharing between the two countries. They're still very structurally integrated in the post Cold War era. And even with relations turning more and more sour, that is still the case. Now, will that change down the road? They probably will work to isolate Hungary, both within the infrastructure of NATO and the European Union over the coming years. But for all we know, this could be a more substantial warning rather than a piece of rhetoric coming from, once again, the head of government of an actual European Union country. May be privy to the fact that, and of course he didn't name a nation by name, but for all we know, he could be saying, yeah, Poland's going to get involved in this war and it's going to escalate and it's going to drag the entirety of Europe down to the depths of hell.
Right. And Poland, I think, also believes that America will never abandon it. And America has taken significant steps to make Poland the number one American partner in Europe. France and Germany really are on the sidelines as far as continental Europe is concerned. Of course, Britain still holds the highest position. Um, now, uh, this, I think, I personally don't think, though, the Poles are they are invested in this idea, right? But they're not in, and to a great degree, but not for the same reasons and not in the same way the Ukrainians are, in like this invincibility of America and this undying loyalty to their cause, right? Because for the Poles, of course, for them to be, for instance, like let's say the war goes into a stalemate, right? The Poles won't be happy, but the Poles are essentially unscathed. Germany is off the map. It is economically going in ruin. Uh, the last quarter of 2022 for companies in Europe were extremely bad. That has recently been published in Bloomberg. So Poland
Bankruptcies
understands
are through
that
the
it's
roof in
going to.
Europe as well.
What?
Personal
Say that
and
again.
personal and business bankruptcies are through the roof in Europe as well.
Yes, yes, and so uh, Poland's economy actually did a little bit better than Germany's, and of course Britain's did the worst. But definitely Germany is second in the worst performing economy in Europe, and so Poland understands that like it does have kind of like a win-win situation if the war stops or if it continues. But if it continues for a very long time, I think they will be expected to go in. And I think at that point, the Poles, like there would have to be a false flag where Poland feels compelled to fight against Russia. Like that's, I don't think that Polish public opinion is at a point right now where they will go along with a public declaration of war against Russia by going into Ukraine. Now, one of the ways I think they're going to circumvent that is, well, first of all, they just minted a coin today that features the city of Lwów, as the Polish would say it, and it has something like "faithful to the end" written on it in Polish. Also, there are talks of, because the Poles recently sent in hundreds of Polish policemen into the Lwów area in western Ukraine, and there are talks to hand over the city of Lwów and um, uh, essentially the oblast around it that it belongs to the Polish embassy. And from there, like they're right now they're building a base, and they're claiming that this base cannot be destroyed. So I'm assuming it's underground. And So they're going to claim basically that this is Polish territory, and if the Russians attack, then they're going to ask for Article 5. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Americans are going to go along with it, but that would drag Poland in. The question is, does the average Pole think that is legitimate? Does the average Pole is the average Pole so invested in Lvov that this technicality, because like under any circumstances, Ukraine would never hand over a city and its oblast to another country and say it's yours now, right? They know the circumstances, so I don't think the Poles are quite there yet. They're not motivated that way, but who knows?
And you do have to
Maybe they can be
recall,
persuaded.
with the question of irredentism, because Lwów was a Polish city for many years, a very ethnically intermixed city, whether you want to call it Lwów, Lviv, Lemberg, as it was known under the Austrians, and it was site of some pretty aggressive ethnic cleansing in the interwar and World War II period, if you will recall.
Yeah,
And we'd actually discussed this back in, I think it was May of 2022, about the possibility of some sort of integration in order to drag Poland further into this war. And I will say, with that, although I'm sure there are many Poles who have the irredentist fantasy, who believe that they can reclaim the borders of the Commonwealth of old, and as every nation has those kind of people, those kind of people who are very wedded to this past idea of great glory. In terms that I think most Poles, even Polish nationalists, self-proclaimed Polish nationalists, realize that that era is over. That Lvov has been a Ukrainian city for the past 80 years, about,
yeah,
and that in terms of demographics, it's almost entirely Ukrainian now.
yeah,
And this was this also reminds me of the missile story, the missile that did land in Poland, and the claims were refuted, saying it was a wayward missile, wayward Ukrainian missile at that. That they, although I don't think they planned that out, it was certainly the opportunity to develop a narrative around this, which is why they sat on it for hours before reporting it. And even then,
hmm
whether it was because they couldn't twist the facts in their favor or they genuinely got cold feet, we still didn't see a greater Polish intervention into this war. So it would take
yeah,
something even more than that. And
yeah,
is it beyond Washington or any of the Western powers or the Polish government itself to stage some sort of false flag or put itself in some sort of situation where it has no choice but to intervene in Polish public opinion? I think that's a big if, but once again, out of any of the nations that could actually make a dent, because I think the Baltic states have more of that fervor to actually get involved in this, but of course they have less means and resources. But in terms of a
and they
nation,
just have less men,
yes.
you know.
But in terms of a nation that could actually change the directions, where I'm not even going to necessarily say turn the tide, but in something that could really put something in Ukraine's camp, it would be Poland, given the amount of support given and the population resources able to give. So I think
Yeah,
it's a very real possibility. I'm not going to put a percentage number on it, but it is becoming a greater and greater possibility with each passing day. And although it seemed to have tapered off there, the idea that they're try this weird territorial gerrymandering with Ukraine in order to try to make into a situation where Poland is justified in going to war, that's a very that's a very strange game to play. And I it could be perhaps preparation for a future conflict, the same future conflict that Stoltenberg and Borrell keep telling us that's going to be on the horizon, and the possibility of a rum state of Ukraine being in a frozen conflict before reigniting, and that rum state, just in the case of this hypothetical scenario, would receive the pledged aid, and then in hopes the conflict would reunite, that would be what draws it in, and that's what they hope. Where they would try to give Russia the temporary concession, the temporary victory, or quote unquote victory, as they would call it, before trying to escalate this war with a much more Ukraine aligned NATO rum state, promising them all this territory back, blah, 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 the whole 9 yards. But the idea of this war spreading to Eastern Europe, I would say, since the beginning of this war, and especially sitting here now, as the date of recording, 3rd of March 2023, is a very real and very viable possibility. This isn't some outlandish thing, for example, like American boots on the ground in an official capacity, or British or French boots on the ground in official capacity. No, what we're talking about here is a scenario that, if this were to happen within the next 3 to 6 months, I would not be surprised in the slightest.
hmm Yeah, I mean I think the Americans know fully well that, and the British and the French for that matter, they're not going to go in. No way, no way. There would be massive protests. Not that that has always worked, but this is too close to home. This is not Iraq, right? It's neither Iraq that much further away. It's also not Iraq in the sense that they couldn't, like, you won't get hurt if you go there. Like, they understand that Russia could hurt them in their own territories if Russia felt like it was cornered. Um, I think they're cognizant of that. Poland does strike me as a country that thinks Russia won't do it. Definitely the Baltic states. I mean, they're literally saying it's time to give Ukraine nuclear bombs, because nuclear missiles, because if we don't, nothing will stop the Russians. The Ukrainians aren't doing so well right now, so we have to do this. A different I don't recall. I don't know if he was Lithuanian or Estonian, but you know, uh, he was suggesting the Lithuanian president. Yeah, Russia has no red lines. We should just keep going. Um, like I think America is careful about that. I think they understand. Uh, they America does want to escalate. Don't get me wrong, uh, but they want to escalate on their timeline and in their way. And one of the most disturbing things that I've seen, Patriarch Kirill has been criticized as being too pro-war. However, um, the not the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian Orthodox
The State
Church, which
Department
is
Church.
yes, which is you can thank Patriarch Bartholomew of the Ecumenate of Constantinople. Um, you can thank him for and the CIA for creating this church. So there was around Bakhmut, there was a dead Ukrainian soldier, and you see the Russian guys, this Russian guy going through his pockets, takes out his passport. Inside the passport is a little card laminated to keep it from bending, and on it written from this church saying it is not a sin to kill Russians. Um, it is the Russian world that must be destroyed and moved out of this world forever. Like, that's the kind of soft escalation. Recall that when Biden was in Ukraine, he did meet with the head patriarch of this church. So I don't know how long Ukrainians have had this little message from their heretical church. So I can't say one thing or the other. Uh, um, but definitely Biden meeting with the patriarch is significant.
Yes, and in terms of, we had discussed this several months back with the engendering of generational hatred between Russians and Ukrainians in particular, but Russians and the wider European world as well, where we've seen this ongoing since at least 2014, and then with the escalation in 2018 with the State Department Church, as I will continue calling it. And once again, I don't know how old these are, but it is creating a civilized, at this point, a metaphysical justification. I mean, not that
Yeah,
there wasn't before, but a pen to paper metaphysical description, description, the metaphysical justification of this war that's ongoing right now, that will likely not be gone anytime soon. And I can only really see escalation from that point forward. Now, how this rhetoric will trickle into Western countries, for example, don't get me wrong. I don't think that even the Roman Catholic Church is going to put out anything like this in Poland. Don't. I'm not insinuating
Yeah.
that, but in terms of like the Polish civic religion, as it were, the Polish national identity, or pick an Eastern European country, will that start to be ingrained into them over the next few years? Because although, as we were discussing, maybe this conflict will become frozen. Maybe Russia will take something of a victory by assuming control of the territories that it has fought long and hard for. But that's probably not going to be the end of this. It could be a very real possibility where they do freeze this conflict and put it on the back burner for years to come and wait to reignite it at the right time. That's a very real possibility in terms of perhaps we will get a breather of peace before this escalates into a much greater war, and that's when you see everyone else get involved.
Mhm.
There's too many variables up in the air to really be making those predictions, but during that time, whether Poland were to intervene tomorrow or not at all, they will still continue feeding these kind of narratives to the people of Ukraine in particular and the wider Western world as a whole. And unless there's really some sort of substantial peace, like what Hungary talks about, like even possibly could say what China talks about, you're going to get this because any peace, quote unquote, that comes from the West at this point is going to be viewed as just freezing the conflict and coming back to it later.
Right. I mean, I could see this scenario. That is, um, in the next year, Ukraine goes on this like slow retreat, city per city, if they're capable of doing it. Like if it would not break Ukrainian morale. And you notice how they keep Ukrainian morale going. Zelensky said two interesting things in the last 24, 48 hours. One was they have, don't be surprised if American men and women also die in Ukraine, if you don't give us these arms, right? And that's the other thing about the Ukrainian identity. It is not just the belief that America will never abandon them, but the belief in superior Western and American technology. um, I remember that a lot of Ukrainians actually believe that Russians are even poorer than they are. Um, so, for instance, they like the way to keep their morale buoyed is, the HIMARS are coming. This is coming. It's always a slow trickle, but the amount of faith they have in this process is really amazing, right? Um, they know they can never do this on their own, and there really is no one else. So, um, you know, that is what's keeping their hopes up. Now, let's suppose they go on this retreat, and that would enlarge the Russian front line, which means they would have to send in more troops, right? That would take away troops from the east. And it would be at that moment that America would probably be willing to go for a move. My guess is America won't do anything until after the election, not before it.
Oh
Like
yes,
I
especially
think
considering the
I think it would spook America way too much, and even Biden is not enough of a stooge to go for it. There's enough vainglory in Biden that he would want to be reelected, and I don't think they're going to go for it. If it happens, then someone else has made the decision, and Biden be damned. But I could see that kind of a scenario where America feels it has no choice, but Russia is so preoccupied with Ukraine that it can't be a tangible um, effect in the war to help out China. Because, of course, if America goes to war with China, they will not be soft the way the Russians were for the first 9, 10 months of the war. You had places like really until mid-October, most Ukrainian towns and cities had Wi-Fi, running water, like none of the scorched earth attack that the Americans are famous for. I think if war broke out with China, it would be that, and they would never apologize for it, of course. So that's a possible scenario, right? Given the way the war is going, um, an escalation, like I cannot see America going into a war with China alone. It would need Japan. It would need Poland. It would need the British. It would need the Canadians. It would be a big deal. It would be a very big deal. It would not be resolved quickly. Um, I mean,
And that's
maybe there's
barring
just
it not even going nuclear as well.
right, right. Would they go that far? You know, it's the $60,000 question.
Pretty low stakes for what we're considering, but I'll allow it. But getting back to the question of Ukraine and prolonging this war, a couple stories about ammunition supply. So, Bulgaria has agreed to revamp production of ammunition to send to Ukraine. Now, keep in mind, Bulgaria was one of the first nations to really say that it did not want to continue funding this war, that the initial ammunition that it had provided at the beginning of this war, it had said that it's no longer going to be a free ride. And the significance of Bulgaria in particular, at the time of the war breaking out, was the main Ukrainian artillery piece had the ammunition, the shell that it used at that point was still only manufactured in Bulgaria. So when they had cut off the free ride, that was a pretty significant step, and that was summer of 2022, mind you. And
Mm,
according to the New York Times, there is a factory in Tarom, Bulgaria that is has agreed to produce the 122 millimeter shell. Now, as the Ukrainian arsenal has diversified, they're not as reliant on that particular shell that they were for the beginning stages of the war. But you're still getting Bulgaria, which has been a nation that has been not entirely with the party line. I wouldn't say it's anywhere like Hungary that has been completely deviant, but Bulgaria hasn't exactly towed the party line when it comes to this war. And although this is a singular factory, but when it comes to shipping arms, you need state approval and everything, they are back in on the providing of perpetual arms to Ukraine. So that's not a surprise. Bulgaria, throughout its history, throughout its modern history especially, has been a very wishy-washy nation. It doesn't tend to stay on one side or the other for too long. For anyone who knows anything about perhaps any of the Balkan Wars or the
Mhm.
or the World Wars for that matter, that it's very shifty, and I think it's just a consequence of their geographic location uh, combined with their historical memory of how they conduct themselves. So, who knows? Bulgaria could also be the war that the nation that cost Ukraine this war. Anything is really possible at this point. But more interesting in this, go
mhm.
ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to get on some of the Serbia stuff. If you have some comments on Bulgaria, I would get them out of the way now.
Uh, no, I think I was just going to say that uh, one of the ways that Ukraine is receiving these munitions, particularly for artillery, is by using Canada. So Canada is going around. It has set up companies that ostensibly buy munitions from other countries, even countries that are like favorable to Russia, like Iran, for instance, and then it funnels them into Ukraine. So there's this kind of like third party, and that's what's Canada's not the only country doing that. Of course, the U.S. is as well.
Well, I was actually just about to bring
Uh,
up the smuggling operations. You took the words
yeah,
right out of
yeah.
my
Go ahead.
mouth. So, there has been the purchase of arms. Canada has been the main one that has been proven to do this, but whether it be from Serbia, Hungary, Iran, Bulgaria, and there was concern over Serbia, which is currently in negotiations with the European Union over European integration, and of course the ever-present Kosovo situation, about Serbia having capitulated and sent arms to Ukraine. Now, it turns out that story was once again a bit of a misleading one, because you had once again Canada buying the arms and sending them through proxy companies before handing them over to the third countries that get to Ukraine. And this has been even from CTSO nations, where they'll have these nations that will just sell off their arms stockpiles as they've been doing for the past 30 years, and they end up in Ukraine. So this is the new way going forward, and mind you, like once again, that's a large part of the Transnistria question, the amount of post-Soviet arms and ammunition in there. And you'll recall, I believe it was back in January, where the U.S. State Department was making offers to nations like Venezuela and Cuba, where they will buy out their old arms stockpiles and supplement them with modern U.S. weapons if they send their old stockpiles to Ukraine. These nations that are, I would say, at least marginally Russia aligned, Cuba and Venezuela. Maybe not as much as they would have been during the Cold War, especially in the case of Cuba, but still, that it's not exactly like relations have soured to any great degree. But they are poaching these arms from wherever they can and sending them abroad. Just anything they can really do to get their hands on. It does make you question, is it sympathetic elements in some of these nations? For example, is it a somebody in Iran, or they said some CSTO nations, maybe Kazakhstan, certain elements within these nations who are less sympathetic to the Russians who facilitate these trades? Is it just the oversight of some bureaucrat? It really does make you wonder what's going on from, once again, these nations that are either on good terms, if not outright allied with Russia, having their arms stockpiles end up in Ukraine. And now there was a story, we'll get into some of it with Kazakhstan, where military vehicles, allegedly, from Kazakhstan were bought from a third party and ended up in Ukraine. Now, the Kazakh Foreign Ministry has denied this, and this, of course, was around the same time as the visit of Blinken, which we will get into in a little bit here. But it does show, once again, what I can only consider a gaping hole in security, that you have something like this happening even on the smallest of scales, that this is just an open door to funnel in arms to Ukraine, not only arms to Ukraine, but arms that they are familiar with using, these Soviet-style weaponry, these Soviet-style systems, unlike a lot of these Western systems, which they have to become acclimated to. So, it really does make you question what the response is going to be, even from ostensibly friendly governments. And I do think I'll have quite a bit more to say about this when I get into the Kazakhstan story, so I'll hold off on that for now.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is. I agree with you, but there isn't really much that Russia can do about it. Some of it, again, is optics. Some of these stories, I think, are also exaggerated, again, to keep morale up. That these countries are betraying Russia. Just hang in there, hang in there. That's been basically the model, for the entirety of this war. The flip side of as long as it takes is just hang in there, just hang in there.
Trust the
Um,
plan.
yeah, it's trust the plan. Um, that said, Ukraine, you know, even in Western publications, they're talking about the disparity in artillery between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are also running out of tanks, any tanks. Even Zelensky, although he promised we will have a tank force and we will have aircraft,
We were saying off air that a lot of this could be for the purpose of a frozen conflict later, right? It would be difficult for the Russians, for instance, um, to stop, let's say, the transfer of maybe even nuclear missiles, right? Um, into the silos that were there from the Soviet era. I mean, it would be very tricky, no doubt. And so far, I think there's a strong reluctance from doing that. But that would be a major game changer in the war. But we can go back to Kazakhstan because Blinken's visit wasn't really all that successful from a surface analysis.
No, and I do have the statement from the foreign minister of Kazakhstan in relation to the visit, so I will just get that right here. And you had his statement. Kazakh foreign minister Mukhtar Tluberdi said at a press conference with the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, "At this moment, we do not see or feel any risk from the Russian Federation. Kazakhstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, the CSTO, the Confederacy of the Commonwealth of Independent States." Excuse me. I'm not going to get into the Civil War question at least right now, but along with other states that border Russia or are located in this region. Therefore, we consider relations with Russia as an alliance that functions within the framework of these multilateral structures. Kazakhstan continues to pursue a multi-vector foreign policy, thereby maintaining a system of checks and balances to ensure a mutual cooperation and mutual benefits with all countries, etc., etc. So that was a very soft statement as saying we have no interest in flipping on Russia and becoming yet another satellite of the American empire to function as another wedge in Russia, another fire under Russia's belly. Now, they, of course, did the diplomatic thing where they said, well, we're seeking cooperation and mutual benefit with all nations, including the United States. But that's also in line with Kazakhstan as the secondary power it is. It's going to court the other powers, but by no means does that mean it's going to flip on the U.S. It's almost, and I mean, them being a Turkic people is funny enough. It's almost like the way Turkey does, where because of its position, because of its resources, it has the ability to bounce between the different spheres of the world and be relatively amicable with all of them, even the U.S., despite that statement. It's not like when Lukashenko played the game he did years ago up until the color revolution they tried on him, because Belarus is admittedly a much smaller and less strategically significant nation to both sides of this equation. I would say more so insignificant to the Western side than the Russian side, but that's beside the point. But it was an affirmation that, once again, we're about a year or so out from the last color revolution attempt, that Kazakhstan does not consider Russia a threat, it considers it an ally, and it has no interest on radically altering its quote unquote balanced foreign policy and will continue cooperation with the Russians. Now, keep in mind, you had Lavrov there just a month ago saying that there needs to be a more common economic market between the two nations as well. So, while there is a sizable risk of another color revolution in Kazakhstan, another foreign policy flip in Kazakhstan, for the time being, if the current power structures remain in place, which I do think they have the longevity to remain in place for the near future, it is not going to be a problem for Russia, despite how much the U.S. State Department might want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, if any place is likely to that could possibly have a color revolution, it would be Serbia. Serbia is under intense pressure. They're asking Vucic, and again, there was fake news that he agreed with it. The idea that he should recognize Kosovo, and the language that is used in this proposal is so ridiculous. We'll protect your Orthodox churches. Well, I mean, that was agreed upon in 2013. So, like, what have you been doing for the last? Obviously, for 10 years, you haven't been able to fulfill this, and this idea of communities and different identities, minorities will be respected in each country, blah blah blah. I mean, obviously, that's not the case either, right? I mean, he signs this. The Albanians are not going to waste any time to trigger Article 4, because the whole purpose of this is to get Kosovo to become not a de jure but a de facto, sorry, the reverse that, nation of NATO. Of course, Russia sits on the Security Council, and Russia is never going to agree with it. Russia is less likely to recognize Kosovo than Serbia. Um, that would put Russia in a difficult situation, let's say, for a consistency in argument. But uh, I don't think Russia will care. You see Vucic basically saying, "Well, we condemned this war from the beginning, and we respect Ukraine's territorial rights and integrity, and so on and so on."
All the mantras that must be repeated to stay in their good graces.
Right, right. And like NATO won't care. Like NATO wants you in NATO, because like once you're in NATO, you will never get out. Um, once you're in the EU, you're finished. You will never get out. They will destroy you if you try to leave. And
The
both
UK,
of
which
these,
was one of the powerhouses of the European Union,
yeah.
economically and strategically speaking, was raked over the coals for their referendum and their decision to follow through on what could be called, for lack of a better term, the will of the people.
And
And
it's over. They're
yeah,
they're going to they're going to reverse it.
yes,
Uh,
and as we were discussing, well, first the entire Brexit debacle through all the negotiations and all the economic turmoil as a result of the 2020 pandemic, COVID, that kind of stuff, and the fallout from the economic situation of the outbreak of this war, as we said, has put the UK behind economic growth, behind Poland, behind smaller Eastern European nations, and we've seen a shrinkage of their economy. We've seen people get poorer there, and for all of that, they're still going to be dragged back into the European Union, even just in an unofficial capacity. But the European Union will still own that nation as it did even before Brexit. So that's what they do to. So the option they show to Europe is you can either stay, you can enjoy your relatively comfortable position as it is now, even though it might not be that comfortable at times, or if you dissent, we can rake you over the coals and ultimately still maintain control over your nation like we did with the UK.
and really, it based on what the goals were for the Brexiters, virtually nothing has been fulfilled. It's a distinction without a difference, particularly the question of sovereign waters, and even more importantly, immigration. Uh, it's changed nothing. So, particularly immigration is actually worse than before Brexit. So they're not serious about it. And then you have King
As is
Charles,
immigration worse in Italy after Maloney's election as well.
right? And you have King Charles is, essentially agreeing with the direction that is going. So Brexit is over; it's finished. I think in many ways, Britain was a holdout, and um, because of its traditional alliance with America, it could probably get away, and its economic power, particularly the financial and banking sector in London City, it could get away with it, right? But after 7, 8 years of efforts, they've managed to essentially reverse it. Now, if it had been a country like Greece or Italy, it's laughable. Like they will never leave. It's over. They will never be sovereign states. Like the world would have to go through something so cataclysmic, which would mean like America would be so negatively affected that it could
America would have
no
to have a
longer.
Soviet style collapse for the vast majority of European nations to ever enjoy anything that could come close to sovereignty ever again.
Right. Right.
And with that being said, I just do have a few more pieces of news out of Europe. I'll cover some of Orban's other statements. So, Orban, uh, Hungary as a nation, along with Iran and Kazakhstan, have expressed support for Chinese negotiations for peace in Ukraine. And of course, the White House responds, quote, China is not a fair mediator between Russia and Ukraine. We see it's clearly on the side of Russia, and the fact that China tomorrow is hosting the president of Belarus proves this. So, to nobody's surprise, that was completely shot down by Washington, the idea that China could mediate some sort of peace. And Orban, in his series of statements, had also said that Europe needs to become a more independent force and cooperate more in its own defense. Pipe dream, yes, but it's the correct rhetoric to have in a time like this.
Yeah.
I'll give him that much. Another quote from Orban: Arabs, Brazilians, Indians, Chinese, Turks want a speedy end to the conflict. However, the West has lost the ability to unite the world for the sake of one cause. Once again, it's not an accurate statement at all. And finally, out of Hungary, we have a number of members of the right wing coalition in parliament who said that they would veto any expansion to NATO involving Finland and Sweden. So that is still off the table. And, I mean, Turkey has still been a holdout from day one, although Hungary has wavered at times, said that, yes, they will eventually support the integration, blah, 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 the boilerplate statements that have to be made when it comes to something like this. So, right now, the lone voice of dissent in the lone consistent voice of dissent against this war, against the current policies in Europe, is Hungary. You'll get nations that waffle back and forth. You'll get nations that policy-wise don't necessarily go along with it, as we were discussing with Austria, Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, etc. But as we've seen with Serbia and Bulgaria, there's a bit of waffling, especially in Bulgaria's case. And to continue on with Europe, Borrell wants the European economies on a wartime footing in order to manufacture the arms and supplies that Ukraine will need to fight this war. Now, once again, I will say this goes back to what we had touched on earlier in the show. This is likely preparing for a second round of this war after some sort of ceasefire or frozen conflict ensues, where they can rearm what's left of Ukraine in hopes of turning this into a much more bloody war for Russia in the long run, because that is really their last ditch. And as we were discussing, Europe is being dragged down into hell, and the only thing that can liberate them once again is a Soviet-style collapse of the United States, which your guess is as good as mine, depending on the way America conducts its foreign policy and its domestic policy over the next 20 years, let's just say, to give an arbitrary figure there. And it does bring up a lot of questions as to what the viability of a second round of a Ukrainian conflict would look like, how Russia would deal with that, and what the ultimate outcome of Ukraine is, because that is still a question that is very much in the air right now, that even after all this time, we really do not have a solid answer for from either side. Now, of course, we do have the boilerplate statements, especially from the Western side, about Ukrainian freedom, democracy, restoring their territorial integrity, and disciplining Russia before they can re-enter the community of nations, blah, 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 blah. But from the Russian side, it's a bit more dubious as to, and I know people have been discussing this since the beginning of the war, like what is their final image for Ukraine. But putting all of that aside, the European Union has also moved to threaten China with the severing of their most recent trade deal if they do fully commit to the Russian war effort and do provide them arms. Now, keep in
Mhm.
mind, this is the largest trade deal in both European Union and I believe also Chinese history. I think, at least mutually between the two, it was the largest trade deal China has ever signed with the European Union and vice versa. And that has been that was at the end of 2020, and it does show once again. I don't have the maps on me because I just got the new computer, so you'll have to forgive me for that. About the maps comparing from I believe it's 2000 to 2020, the top trade partner of each country, whether they trade more with China or the U.S.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it
It's a reversal.
yes, most of the map was blue representing the U.S. in 2000, and now most of the map, including Europe, is red in 2020. So the idea of sanctions on China is just
Hmm. It would wreck Europe.
completely contrary to any logical processing. Now, once again, I'm not even asking you to have a positive view of the Chinese, even from an external perspective. But point being is, the economies have become so intertwined that you are not going to sever this trade deal without completely plunging what is left of the developed European economy, what's left of first world Europe, down, once again, to use this phrase the third time in the show, down to the depths of hell. Because
Hmm.
that is honestly, unless there is a radical revolution in Europe overnight that can expel, maybe not all, but a significant amount of the American influence, the continent is trash. Now, we've
Yeah.
said this before, the continent's completely under American control, but as this war drags on, the direction it's going, and the response of the American empire and its cohorts in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, in London, etc., 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 is going to be the civilizational death of this continent. I'm not even talking about in terms of, say, the more abstract civilizational death. I mean, in terms of any global relevance is going. I mean, it's arguably gone already, but any remaining global relevance is going to be completely evaporated, and
Right.
this continent will be a backwater. And I don't say this out of any sort of hatred or animosity towards Europe. In fact, I very much would like them to do well. I think that if we could rearrange the cards tomorrow, reshuffle the deck tomorrow, that the cooperation of a European bloc with Russia would be a near unstoppable force that would probably, in my opinion, be a great good for the world overall. But that has been completely destroyed. And once again, I think that gets back to the main reason the U.S. had to instigate this war, because although it was drifting apart, although there were tensions, this was the death knell of any possibility of that happening, barring,
Hmm.
once again, radical revolution in Europe is the only thing that could restore that and thereby save Europe as a relevant global force. But other than that, it's going. I can't even venture guess the future of the continent. Maybe mass immigration. I don't imagine that the amounts of immigrants from, say, Africa or the Middle East would still be as eager to come to these nations that have fallen into complete irrelevance, even economically speaking. And will we get another wave of immigration from Europe to the Americas? I don't think that's an
It's
unreasonable
yeah.
an unreasonable sort of prediction going into the next 30 to 40 years. And who knows, this could be the this could be what saves the demographic question. What could reboost the white American population? I'm kidding. That's not going to happen because
There's certain interest groups that would not want to see that,
of course not.
particularly because of this of the current war.
Yeah,
Uh,
I look. I'll be straightforward. They're all going to just go to Argentina.
I mean,
It's going
America's
to be
not
Latin
accepting
America,
any Ukrainian
honestly.
refugees.
Yeah,
They're
it's
not gonna. They're not gonna do it.
no. I mean, look, I'm being, and you. I know you realize this, and I know most of the audience probably realizes. I'm being a bit tongue in cheek here, but I do
Yeah.
think the possibility of tens of millions of European immigrants going to places like, once again, with America, because of the immigration laws, because there's certain interests that don't want it, but maybe to places like Argentina, maybe to places like Uruguay, maybe to some of these more still European admixture parts of Latin America, or maybe hell, even somewhere like Australia, New Zealand, that although aren't perfect, at least demographically speaking, are more coherent than, say, the U.S. or Canada might be. So, I mean, we're talking about the death of a continent. I don't know
Hmm.
how else to put it. And like I said,
Yeah.
unless within, I would say, the next 3 to 5 years, maybe that's drastic, but just for the sake of argument, next 3 to 5 years, there is a complete overhaul of the European Union, European politics, and the individual leadership of the major European countries, then yeah, it is completely screwed, and there's really no recovering from it.
Well, I mean, there are certain narrative shifts that are happening. I saw Jimmy Dore on Rachel Maddow's show, and she had to just lump it and take it as he described how this war was provoked. Ukraine did have an American organized coup, primarily by Victoria Nuland, Kagan's wife. Kagan is, of course, one of the guys of the Pact for the New American Century. He's part of those dudes that go way back to the Paul Wolfowitz doctrine of balkanizing Russia from 1992, 93.
Possibly more infamous for the Iraq War and the Middle
Yeah,
Eastern policy of the Bush administration, but
yes.
yes.
Eh, so that was kind of shocking to see that. I did not expect to see that. Um, I had something else in mind that has completely slipped me, but so there are. I think we're kind of in an uncertain time right now, and a lot of this depends on what is America going to be satisfied with. Well, I think America is satisfied with a much poorer and obedient Europe. That I think for sure. Regardless of what happens with, let's say, demographics, because it will leave certain groups and a certain group in Europe to have even more power in Europe than they already do. Uh, in the same way that power was consolidated during the COVID years and the kind of economic disaster that had on middle and low income and basically their assets, right? So I think America is fine with that. Does America want to reindustrialize? That would depend on like how America manages greed, and like America has so much greed that to bring back manufacturing and to make it plausible is going to be very hard. Because take for instance, you brought up, what if there were sanctions with China? Well, at the moment China's playing to some extent the American cultural game, so they know like which brands are wanted really badly. And but the thing is China has a lot of little companies that want to be big companies. And if some of these big brand names left, let's say it's a footwear company that basketball players love. Um, there are comparable companies that can make the same kind of footwear for a fourth of the price, a fifth of the price, and it would be very hard for European and Western countries, but particularly European countries, to deal with this. Again, how it's going to cause unrest. How well can America manage this? I think is something to consider.
Oh, and mind you, the pivot
It's
to
come back to
Asia
me.
has
The,
also.
the,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, the German government again has said, listen, Nord Stream 2 is still viable. It can still work, right? So, again, there's a contradiction going on because Schultz is meeting Biden. Biden gave him some compliments, but he has stated even before Schultz landed, he said that this would be a more private conversation because the last conversation didn't go well. And he's already complimented Schultz for doing everything he can, blah blah blah. But he's basically going to tell Schultz, listen, your companies are not viable anymore. They're going to come to America. It's over.
It's over for you. And Scholz will be the guy that completely sold out Germany in like the biggest way possible.
A worse
And
sellout than Merkel. That is quite the quite the
yeah,
feat, honestly. I wouldn't call it an
Merkel is
accomplishment
a
because
patriot compared to
oh,
Scholz.
absolutely. Uh,
I mean, I've always said that like her pipeline deals betrayed this idea that she was just stringing Putin along because these wouldn't be destroyed in a war. Like I don't know. I've always found her hard to believe. Uh, I think her resigning was a way to absolve herself from any involvement in this war. Um, I think she liked the lucrative deals. I don't think that was a ploy. I don't think that was a trick just because she's parroting what Poroshenko said. Um, and then Hollande, I mean, nobody even pays attention to Hollande anymore, but he had to parrot. All these people parrot stuff all the time, right? Um, it doesn't mean that not respecting Minsk doesn't mean they were for this war, because what you're saying basically by what they have said, repeating Poroshenko's words, is essentially saying, yeah, we wanted this war. Um, Hollande and Merkel, no, I don't think so. Poroshenko, yes. Um, but they're just doing that to demonstrate fealty to America, because America, of course, definitely wanted this war.
oh, of course. And
But I think they just felt they could have it both ways.
I did want to touch on some of the points you were making about China and Asia when it comes to the manufacturing. Now, the counter that a lot of people will have to that is, what about Indonesia? What about Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera? Well, these nations, which the U.S. spent the last decade courting, have been completely pushed away from it as a result, as a matter of fact, of this war. That the outright belligerence when it comes to the enforcement of sanctions with this has driven away so many of these. I don't necessarily want to call them neutral, but less aligned, less ideological, less dedicated nations that do have these manufacturing potentials, that do have these resources. You would think India, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., etc. And conversely, relations have increased with China. Even Vietnam, which was on a very poor footing with China for many years, that the U.S. did, from a credit where credit is due strategically, did exploit that to a great degree from the 2000s onwards. That's going to be completely undone. I mean, you even have surveys coming out of Vietnam that most of the population prefers a future more aligned with China economically than the United States. So that's completely out the window. And the idea that American manufacturing, as much as I think that, yeah, America does need a strong manufacturing sector if it's going to be a serious country. But I mean, asking America to be a serious country in 2023 is a big ask, I know. But fundamentally, at a certain point, it's not going to be the manufacturing power it was, say, in the immediate post-war era, or even what it was throughout the height of the Cold War. That sure, it can restore a strong domestic industry, but in terms of the cheap manufactured goods that you need, they're going to come from places like China and places that, frankly, China are outsourcing to, like Vietnam, like some of these places in Africa, like India, where they're passing on the more, let's just say, menial manufacturing work to these nations, which once upon a time were closer to the U.S. But once again, we look at the direction of trade referencing that one map again. Which once again, my apologies that I don't have it on my new computer yet. That are far more economically integrated with China. So, what the strategy going forward here is, so far as DC is concerned, just in general, I
Yeah.
have absolutely no clue. And
I mean, leadership in these other Asian countries are like looking at what America is willing to do to Europe to maintain its hegemony, right? You don't think they're thinking the same thing? Like, if they draw closer to America and they think the possibility of America going to war with China is increasing, You don't think they're going to be impoverished the way Europe is? Of course they do.
And
They,
it does make me really curious about the question regarding Japan, because Japan is in a very strange situation where it is much like Germany, that it is a U.S. military base through and through. But this is a country that still is importing oil from Russia via the Sakhalin pipeline, a country that over the past several years, even under who would have been considered a more belligerent leader in Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated last summer, was increasing relations, at least trade relations, with China. This nation that has once again been looking towards alternative to the U.S. You have right there, largest host of U.S. military assets in the Pacific, and that creates quite a predicament. And as you were saying, a lot of these nations are looking at what the U.S. is willing to do to so-called allies in Europe, and thinking, what chance do they stand if they don't diversify right now? And I am really curious about the position of Japan over the course of this next decade, how they will maneuver the very tense situation between the U.S. and China. Given that, I mean, of course, there is a lot of historical animosity between the two, but when they're looking at suffering the same fate as Germany, and I don't even want to imagine what Germany is going to look like in 10 years, historical grievances might be able to at least be temporarily put aside to give way to pragmatism.
I mean, at least once a week or once every 2 weeks, I see an article where Japan reiterates that it cannot survive without Russian oil, and that's a big statement, right? That's a very big statement, and a lot of these countries, they've been around a very, very long time. They've survived because of um, various levels of diplomatic ingenuity, stalwartness, pragmatism, particularly pragmatism. And, they are considering what's happening. And while I think they are afraid of a Russian Chinese alliance and what that could spell for them, they don't want the American alternative either. And so this is why they have to play both sides to some degree in order to maintain this balance, because that's what's going to ensure their survival. But I think if America goes really hot and heavy, it's going to scare them. And really, um, so far, China has not been demanding, let's say, the way the U.S. has. When the U.S. goes to Africa um, and talks about values, you know, demanding that this or that African nation has to recognize gay marriage, right? What is America actually offering? I mean, what is it offering? Like, it's it's using soft power, its culture, and its financialized economy, and dollar printing machine go burr as a way to capture the elite class. The thing is with more prosperous and intelligent states in Asia, that's not the case. It's hard to buy them off, or it's harder to buy them off.
Especially without anything materially, I should say tangible. Where,
Yeah.
once again, getting back to the dichotomy between U.S. and Chinese foreign policy in Africa, where the U.S. will go and pontificate about values and then print off another $100 million to bribe off whatever dictator they need to be on their side, you'll have tangible economic development on behalf of the Chinese. And once again, sure, it is them somewhat selling their soul to the Chinese. And I think when you invest millions of dollars, or billions of dollars in some cases, into tangibles to develop a nation economically, you are entitled to a cut of that. So, just speaking purely from a value neutral sense there.
Hmm.
But it, and with East Asia especially, the bribing off of the political class by printing off another 100 million or $1 billion to have them aligned isn't going to work, especially, as you said, in these more economically developed states. They're going to want to look for actual economic cooperation, something that can bring jobs and money into their nation, which, you guessed it, love them or hate them, that's what China provides.
Right. And so, I mean, in a sense, America's in a pickle, right? Because as I've often said on this show, there were a lot of things that should have happened, that should have gone in place. In one of the deals that was struck between Russia and Ukraine, Britain and America, because of course Britain, America, and Russia were already responsible for Ukraine's security. But one of the deals, of course, was Sevastopol and Crimea. And Russia had a contract to be like basically the major physical shareholder, if you will, of Sevastopol and the naval base there. They could be Ukrainian ships, but the vast majority, up until 2017, had to be Russian. And this was up in, as I just said, in 2017. So um, I often wonder if, like, why have the Maidan coup in 2014 when just 3 years later, did they think that Ukraine wasn't radicalizing fast enough? That's possible, you know. Did they think that Yanukovych, because they had that ridiculous deal that Yanukovych discovered during the Maidan, that all trade could go east to west, but not west to east, with Russia in mind and the EU. And that's why he halted it. So there was a provocation there. I think they felt diplomatically, the Americans felt that 2017 wasn't going to be this pivotal year where Russia was going to be outside of the picture. They needed to do this in order to attain Crimea, but they didn't, and that has prolonged their problem because last week I said Ukraine is Obama's war, just like Yemen and Libya and Syria, and his pivot to China is there's no war there yet, but in many ways um, he's going to be one of the early pioneers of that war. Um, so, my feeling is that they already felt like they were running out of time in 2014, 2013.
I would agree, and as you said, especially given the situation with Yanukovych, who was, I wouldn't even call him pro Russia, but a bit more hesitant to sign completely onto
Yeah,
European integration, that was a non starter, and that would have set them back years. Now, the scenario they've landed themselves in today, they've set themselves back years, but it was either take a chance and succeed. If the Maidan had succeeded without the annexation of Crimea, then we would be living in a very different world today. Russia would be completely on its on the backslide, and it wouldn't even be a question of global relevance. The people who say things like uh, Russia would just be a gas station for China, blah blah blah, that would be true in a world where the Maidan was a complete success, in my opinion. But
mm,
now that we're looking at a much different system here, with these questions that are fundamentally up in the air, with just a slight amount of Russian pushback to that, it has created what can only be called a civilizational crisis all around.
right. And it just shows you how unprepared America and Europe were for this war, because they are scrambling right now, and they're especially America's reputation is on the line. And Zelensky has repeatedly said that this is NATO. This is NATO. America cannot back down. Um, he's upping the ante. He's using escalational language, and um, he's doing that to buy them in. To I mean, it's debatable how much he's in control here. And it's debatable how much free reign he has in saying these kind of things. I don't think everything he's saying somehow contradicts most of Biden's administration. Uh, but that does tie America in the long haul. And of course, Biden said last week, you know, we're going to pay pensions for Ukrainians. Now, it's in many ways, it's up to the American people how much they're willing to take. Um, you look at the cover for the New York Times from this Sunday, and the front page story is kids 13, 15 years old working minimum wage. Um, not necessarily what you would expect.
This is not what I had in mind when I said bring back child labor, but
Yeah.
you got to take your wins where you can get them, I suppose. Uh, but we do have a few stories to round out the show because we are over the 2 hour mark, so I will try to keep it brief here. So we do have the meeting between Lukashenko and Xi Jinping. Just the main points to summarize that. Minsk and Beijing will deepen defense cooperation in the fight against terrorism, particularly in preventing color revolutions. Belarus and China will jointly support the international system, the core of which is the UN, boilerplate stuff as usual. Minsk and Beijing will provide mutual support in mitigating the consequences of unilateral coercive measures. They didn't name the United States by name, but we can all
Yeah,
draw
that's who
that
they're talking
conclusion.
about.
Minsk and Beijing are interested in establishing peace in Ukraine and are ready to participate in direct efforts to restore regional peace. China supports the accelerated entry of Belarus into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Minsk and Beijing agreed to strengthen the cooperation framework that China has on global security. So it was a very positive meeting, and it was part of the larger integration of China and Russia because these are all things that had been previously established between China and Russia as well. But Belarus, still being, at least on paper, a sovereign state, was not part of those. So that is just the second part of that. Almost certainly they will be admitted into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I don't think that will shock anyone.
No.
Nothing too significant out of this meeting beyond the fact that I think, well, of course we expected a high degree of integration with Russia, as it were, with the history between the two nations and with the current situation between the two nations. But I think them taking a step further and increasing that cooperation with China shows that any dreams of a Western Belarus, barring once again that aforementioned color revolution, is completely off the table. That this days of Lukashenko darting back and forth are over, and that Belarus is effectively Russian now. Now, I won't say entirely, but it is what has been for many years. It is an extension of Russia, hence signing the similar, or if not outright the same, agreements with China. A lot of things to become a much more integrated bloc. So,
Mhm.
while there's not much in terms of substance, it is telling of the direction things are going in right now. And with other European news we have here, we covered this last week. Russia sold millions of barrels of oil bypassing European sanctions. Oil and its products are being transferred from one tanker to another in neutral waters off the coasts of mainly Greece and North Africa. Greek authorities have already stated they can't do anything about this because it takes place outside of territorial waters. And since the beginning of 2023, 23 million barrels of Russian oil and refined fuel have been transferred from one tanker to the other on the Laconios Gulf, according to Bloomberg, so take that as you will. And it's alleged this is done on a gray tanker fleet, which consists of ships that then transport them to Asian countries. So the sanctions, insofar as they exist, have more or less been completely bypassed in any significant sense, and showing that as a modern first world industrialized continent, Europe cannot survive without a consistent source of cheap energy in which there are few, if no other options than Russia in that regard,
Hmm.
reinforcing what we and many others have been saying, even just from a value neutral standpoint, for years at this point, and that I will reiterate what I had dedicated a significant part of this show to, and several shows previously to. One of the primary aims of this war by the American Empire is to drive Europe into complete irrelevance, and it is succeeding. You do get acts of defiance like this. You do get workarounds, things that may boon Europe up for a little more. But as this does continue,
Yeah.
things will get worse. And if it's in international waters, what's to stop U.S. forces from seizing it like they have Iranian tankers? What's to
Hmm.
stop quote unquote accidents from occurring with these tankers? If this does continue to go on, 23 million barrels might sound like a lot, but compared to what you actually need to run an industrialized economy, really isn't that much. But if
Yeah.
this does continue, especially in higher quantities, there will be a response, whether outright or a deniable response. I imagine it will start deniable. There'll be some accidents within tankers. There'll be a security incident where one of them just so happens to explode in the middle of the sea. And then it'll get a bit more deliberate. You'll have the U.S. fleet in the Mediterranean. I believe it's the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. Correct me if I'm wrong. Fifth Fleet is the one in the Persian Gulf. They'll be stopping these ships. They'll be harassing them. They'll be seizing them, much like they did with the Iranian tankers, and still do to the Iranian tankers. Not as much as they did just a couple years ago, but it is still an ongoing phenomenon. So as this continues, it will get more brazen, especially if the American Empire is really dedicated to, I will say it for the fourth time in the show, dragging Europe down to the depths of hell.
Yeah. You said off air, how are they going to go on a war economy without the industrial power base that they will surely need? Um, I'd love to see how that rabbit gets pulled out of that hat. And the other Bloomberg headline that caught my eye this week was um, Russian oil was being sold to China for $85 a barrel. Like, there were other countries that completely disregarded, not just China, that completely disregarded the price cap on Russian oil. Nobody's going to pay attention to that.
Even
You
in
know,
Europe, the price cap has been disregarded, and a lot of that is due to the smuggling efforts, or quote unquote
yeah.
smuggling efforts. But the price cap is completely impotent, and it's nothing more than a feel good measure by the ever declining European powers. And there's not really much else you can say about that. And just the final piece of news I'll leave you off with in Europe is that we touched on it briefly, but protests in Moldova do continue. And this is at the same time when you do have the parliament taking what are very symbolic actions, such as changing the name of the language from Moldovan to Romanian. Now, it effectively is the Romanian language, but it was called Moldovan to try to establish it as a separate national identity due to its influence under the Soviet Union and due to try to as the Soviet Union did quite a bit of ethnic gerrymandering, as I'm sure you all know.
Mm-hmm.
But they have changed that, and while I don't think that story is too significant at face value, it is showing that potentially they are moving towards integration with Europe, if not outright reintegration with Romania, if that's even possible at this point. And you have Sandu, who the Moldovan president, who I thought was supposed to have resigned quite some time ago, but it must just be a caretaker government case, a Liz Truss case, where they're waiting for the replacement before finally kicking her out, who said, we, quote, must not allow hotheads to turn Transnistria into a new conflict. We will continue to preserve peace in the country. Now, mind you, the only real voices coming for intervention in Transnistria are from Sandu and her allies. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
other than that, it's not really that. I mean, you even have the former Inspector General of Moldova saying that an attack would be a complete disaster. for the country and for the surrounding region. So, once again, the Transnistria question is something that is going to be resolved in some way, shape, or form. And I think, as I had said at the beginning of the show, the best possible outcome for at least the people of Transnistria is that the Ukraine conflict comes to some sort of freeze over or ceasefire, and as a result, Transnistria is left unharmed.
Yeah.
And at that point, the only thing that could really save the people, now in terms of the land, it's probably forfeit, but Russia could just start mass issuing visas and passports to these people. That's probably the best outcome when it comes to avoiding human cost at the end of the day, if this doesn't boil over into another front in this conflict, which is a very real possibility. But in terms of ethnic Russians living in that land now, they are a bit more recent arrivals to that land. It's not exactly like these parts of Ukraine that they've been for centuries, but still, we're talking about what is potentially the mass exodus of tens, if not hundreds of thousands. I think it's up to hundreds of thousands of people live in Transnistria.
I thought it was 400,000. I'm not sure.
Something along those lines. But point being is the only at a certain point they are going to be pushed off that land, whether by Western Ukrainian and Moldovan forces or whether by voluntary emigration to Russia, which I think the latter is probably the best case scenario. Now, it's not the best scenario altogether, but in terms of what's actually feasible, these people just packing up and leaving is easier said than done to pack up and leave somewhere your family has lived for generations. But in terms of them surviving as an ethnic Russian population, it's not going to be in Transnistria.
Well, I mean, I'm not completely convinced. I don't know. I would say that if America wants an optics victory, a color revolution in Serbia, even though recent statistics showed that more than half don't want to be part of the EU, that's
Never stopped them
66%.
before.
Well, this is what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
right? So, those were the statistics in Ukraine during the Maidan coup. The other thing too is NATO finds a workaround to state that Finland, at least Finland, is now in NATO, right? And that will stave off any kind of feeling of defeat for a little while. If there was a scenario for evacuating the Russians from Transnistria, right? It would have to be worked out where the Russians would take the munitions, because it's the largest munitions in all of Europe, literally more than everything the Europeans have, and all of it is Soviet stock, right? What Ukraine is mostly dealing with now. A lot of it is also very old. But it could be, for instance, a deal could be struck where they get rid of the munitions, and the price, like, okay, Ukraine's not going to get the munitions, but Moldova will get this, the little skinny Transnistria, and the Russians and Ukrainians. These are Ukrainians that have been living there a very long time, and they are on the side of Russia. Remember, the reason they're there is because they defeated the Moldovans and the Romanians in like a little civil war that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's why they're there. So, I don't know for sure that like I don't think Moldova does not sound very confident right now that they're going to make a move for it, and neither does Ukraine. Um, so I'll hold off. That
Yeah.
inevitably they'll leave.
I still maintain that I don't see a, let's just say, bloodless way this doesn't end without evacuation, but ultimately I can't say that for 100% certain until we actually do see what happens. But I am far from optimistic for the people who live
Mm.
there, and once again, we'll see how that turns out. But just to cover some of the last stories I have on the list here, a little bit out of the Middle East. So, Iran has discovered the world's second largest lithium reserve, once again showing the abundance of resources in these nations that are increasingly, well, I suppose in Iran's case, it has been pretty anti Western for the past 40 years, but this increasing anti Western bloc under the umbrella of Russia and China. And this is also followed by weeks of discussion of Iran's nuclear program. Now, as of, I believe, let me just get the exact date here. As of the 28th of February, Reuters claims that Iran is capable of making fissile material for a nuclear bomb in about 12 days. So that would put us at 9 days as of time of recording, or 8 days as of time of premiere. Now, there has been rumblings in Israel in particular about a
Yeah.
strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities. And this has been a conversation that's been going on for years. It's not beyond the capability or, let's just say, believability of Israel to conduct a strike like this. For example, they've been doing this since the 1980s. They struck Iranian nuclear reactors in the 80s. They struck Egyptian ones in the, I think it was also the 80s. They struck as recently as 2007, struck nuclear plants in Syria as well. And these operations are not unheard of, and they're not too unbelievable. But the dynamic of the Middle East has changed much more than, I would say, 2007, 2008. Because keep in mind, Syrian civil war hadn't even broken out at that point. And Israel, in my estimation, is in the weakest position it has been in since the 1967 through 1973 period, with the Six Day War and the Yom Kippur War, respectively.
Mhm.
And given that, they are not, in my opinion, in the position to make a strike on Iranian nuclear sites without facing retaliation, because you have Iranian forces in Syria, you have Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, you have Gaza, which has also been, there's also been a low level rumbling around the question of the Palestinian territories and whether we will see increased violence there, which, given everything, that's not a surprise. So you have three different fronts from which Israel could be struck, as well as the Iranians have developed missiles at this point that could reach Israel. The Iron Dome is not everything it's cracked up to be.
Mhm.
It has, at best, a 60 to 65% interception rate, as opposed to the Israeli claims of a 95% interception rate. But I don't even believe the 60 to 65% interception rate figure.
Yeah, I mean they're shooting down glorified bottle rockets. They're
Yeah,
not.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're not shooting down anything of any significant means, and even with the homemade missiles, those things can very easily, well, I wouldn't say very easily, but in large enough quantities, can overwhelm the system. And if you were to have a combined with those more primitive weapons combined with more sophisticated weapons from either Syria or Iran proper, then there's a very real chance of a significant retaliation in the place of a strike on the nuclear reactors. Now, there has been a back and forth between U.S. officials and Israeli officials trying to convince the U.S. to either jointly participate, if not outright carry this out.
Mhm.
Now, I can't imagine that there wouldn't also be a retaliation on Israel, even if it was just a sole U.S. operation because of how, of course, integrated the two are. But that is the main hangup preventing this, because if this were even just 10 years ago, 2013, let's just say, this reactor would have been cratered as it was.
Oh
The
yeah.
IAF would not have held back on this. And historically, they have not. But I would say ever since 2015, 2016 is post Iran deal, actually, is when the dynamics in the region changed so drastically with the turning of the tide of the Syrian civil war, with the Russian involvement, with Hezbollah really proving itself as a more effective fighting force than just a Lebanese militia. A Lebanese militia that, minded you, dislodged them from the 2006 invasion of Lebanon. And with ever increasing support, both materially and vocally, for the plight of the Palestinian cause, both on a political and, frankly, a military level, they're simply not in a position to wantonly throw around missiles like, as I said, they would have 10, 15 years ago. And that any sort of action like this will see actual consequences beyond just a few primitive rockets.
Hmm. Um, Now, if I'm not mistaken, isn't Millie in Israel now?
I do not know,
I
but I know
thought,
that was either already happened, happening now, or is going to happen in the near future. I know that it is something that you're not just pulling that out of thin air. Is what I'm getting at.
no, yeah, I'm pretty sure, and they've secured a deal with Azerbaijan to park some of their jets there in order to be that just that little bit closer to Iran. Um, I don't know much about these nuclear facilities of Iran. I don't know if some of them have maybe some of this enrichment process is underground already, because they have like extensive underground tunnel systems just for their air force, and their uh, air defense systems are upgraded because of Russia right now. I mean, if it were to happen, like, again, optics, right? They made a really big deal of that drone that dropped an explosive or two on uh, some military base in Iran, but the damage was not like huge. It didn't set Iran back. y- y- you know, the girl boss protests were a bigger threat to Iran than this thing. Um, I think, and I'm not being facetious. They really
No,
were.
I know it's
But um, I mean, I think there's even a hesitancy by the Israelis of, if they did do this and one of their jets got shot down, it would look weak. Even if they carried out the mission, it would look weak. This is why Israel very rarely flies into Syrian airspace. It almost always will shoot outside of um, Syrian
they
airspace.
almost always fire over Lebanon.
Yes, so um, it would be quite a trek. During the Ukraine war, so this year, or it might have been in the summer. Anyhow, a Russian jet actually knocked out with an air-to-air missile, a Ukrainian jet, of a distance like over 250 kilometers. Right, that's a big space,
Oh yes.
and so it's very conceivable that the Israelis, make the bomb attack, but they lose the pilots. Um, because the public perception is that Iran is backwards and isn't capable, and optically it won't look good.
No, and speaking of
But
Lebanon,
something is brewing. Israel might be forced to act one way or another. The Americans, of course, because of Iran's cooperation, they are going to be accepted into the Shanghai Agreement, and we all know. And now with this lithium, I mean, this is a boon for them. The second largest in the world. China is the biggest manufacturer of batteries. This is enormous.
oh, and also mind you that China has extensive trade and port ties with Israel as well. So
Hmm.
there's
Yep.
economic pressure also leaning on them from that direction too. And speaking of
Right.
Lebanon, you were actually telling me actually after we finished last episode about the they have allegedly discovered the cause and the responsible party for the Beirut port explosion in
Yes,
2020.
yes.
So,
Uh,
if,
um,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead
go
with
ahead.
that. No, no, you
Oh,
go.
I thought. Oh, well, as far as I understand, it's a British firm,
Yes,
and the people who were in charge were Ukrainians.
yes, and that was like we said in 2020. That explosion that probably wiped out. Uh, I mean, 25% of Lebanon's trade went through the Beirut port that blew up,
Yeah,
and it cratered their economy. It has not recovered since. You recall that in 2021, 2022 as well, we covered stories about people just looting the banks to get their money out because the economic situation had declined that much, and some of the emigration figures out of Lebanon actually. So with that, it was a British firm led by Ukrainians. You can't get a more modern Western story than that behind this behind this explosion. And Lebanon still hasn't recovered. It's probably not going to recover anytime in the near future. That's one of the other nations that I will use the phrase for the fifth time this episode, dragged down in the depths of hell. And I really don't see any way out for them as well. And I really hate to say it, but it's there's really no viable future for a country like that. I mean,
yeah.
at least in Europe, you can tell a lot of it is, I guess you could say, a combination of self-inflicted and inflicted by the American occupiers. But realistically, they should be able to stand a chance as nations or as a block of nations. But Lebanon, something like that happens, it's just there's no coming back for a
A long
very
time.
very long time, if at all, from something like that. And we'll
I
see.
mean, it also, I think, tends to imply that this was an inside job.
Oh, of
That,
course.
that they did this with the Israelis. It was at the behest of the Israelis, most likely.
Now,
Um,
since when do Ukraine and Israel cooperate on anything?
uh, right.
Two wonderful nations, two peas in a pod. But just to round out very quickly with some of the last stories I have for the show. So, Brazil has allowed Iranian ships to dock in its ports, which is a very. Lula is a very. Now, Lula's a corrupt scumbag who can be dragged along by anyone who has the upper hand on him, which is why you see him putting out such a condemnation of the war as soon as he comes into office, combined with also allowing Iranian ships in the port. So a very incoherent policy on his part. And then, of course, he was shilling a certain inoculation that YouTube may or may not let us mention at this point, but I don't know, but I prefer to play it safe here. And it's been out of Brazil, once again, one of the principal nations of BRICS, very incoherent policy, and I really don't know where to peg them down. I do think Lula is a massive liability, as many faults as Bolsonaro may have had, but it's strange that he would allow Iranian ships in the ports given everything else that is at stake. So I think that'll be an interesting situation to see what comes out of that later, because as of now, I really couldn't tell you what to make of that. It is much too soon to tell. And the
I mean,
last, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think he's just playing the Erdogan game, obviously, right?
Yes.
Like even his attachment to the vaccine and everything, he's just trying to signal to the Americans that he's on board. He's a shitlib just like them. Uh, but COVID is over. It's over. I might have traction in Brazil because the media there during COVID was trying to say that Bolsonaro is a murderer, right?
Oh, horrible,
Um,
horrible, horrible. Yes.
he's basically trying to legitimize his presidency by going with this tired narrative. It might have traction in Brazil. It's unfortunate that it probably has some state power behind it as well, and so innocent people will suffer as a result. However, I think he knows in the West that this is a dead issue. It nobody cares anymore. Um, COVID accomplished a lot for the elites. Um, it's just he's just signaling. He's signaling he's being on the right side of a war that's already over, and him bringing Iran. He's playing both sides. He's maintaining a certain amount of sovereignty by making the Americans mad, uh, and then that's how he keeps his legitimacy and viability.
Yeah, it is the Erdogan game. That is the back and forth he has to play. But with Convid and the narrative being put to rest, you do have the news out about it allegedly being a lab leak once again, and the Republicans in Congress are moving to vote to declassify everything on it now. Will that actually happen? I could not tell you one way or another. It's just red meat to the base. I wouldn't make anything serious of it because that's a fool's errand at the end of the day. And of course, they're releasing this after the issue is completely irrelevant. After what a supermajority of the population already took the needle, and after everything is said and done, after we had damaged the economy and society after 2 years of it, now we can talk about the declassification. Now we can talk where it came from because we need to rile up something against China or whatever because
Yep.
apparently American tax dollars in a China Chinese lab causing Americans to voluntarily shut down their economy. That's why we need to rabble rouse against the Chinese because we shot ourselves in the foot.
Oh, look, this is red meat. This is substantiation. This is a Biden getting tough on China would move like some of the Republican supporters. They're going to make hay with this later. It's going to be trickled for now, but as 2024 arrives, they're go- I personally believe this was developed in a lab in America, and it was brought over. Um, it makes no sense that China would harm itself just to do what to hurt America, like by hurting itself first. It's so stupid. Um, but the kind of tropes that exist in the West, and particularly America, about China are like as ridiculous as they are. They're widely believed, and they're going to get mileage from this. That's my prediction. Um, if things start, the Chinese are already upset by this. So it's going to be useful eventually. You see stupid comments on YouTube and Twitter where people say, "Oh, you know, TikTok, sports teams, blah blah blah. This is how this is how much control the Chinese have over us, right?" And it's a perfect opportunity for Biden to look like the hero. Like I threw off China better than Blumph did. I brought BASF to America, something Blumph couldn't do. I'm serious. This is a godsend for them. I'm not surprised. I even think there might have been a show where we mentioned there was that one show where I kept talking about Ron Owens' idea about how how the lap leak happened, and I'm pretty sure that we agreed that they could use it later against China, and lo and behold, they have, right? Because they don't even have evidence that China is supplying munitions to Russia. They're just pissed off because Russia hasn't run out of missiles, and they know that they're getting the semiconductor chips from the Chinese, and the chips that they're getting are perfectly adequate for their missiles, including their hypersonic missiles. And so now they're going to ratchet this up.
Yes, and it's I really can't add any more to what you're saying because I think you just topped it off so well. But that's what we can look forward to, and that's all I had for today. If you have any last minute additions.
No, that's about it for me too.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of the War Report. We will see you all next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.